this with, this is probably going to get a little bit nerdy for my own benefit. I'm sorry. Hopefully not too nerdy, but
it's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk.
First topic I want to touch on, because I think it gets overlooked and it probably carries over to everything, which is what I'm going to try and cover with all these topics, but foot mechanics and rooting. Foot mechanics is a fancy term, I know, but let's just go with rooting, how you use your feet when you lift, right? Everyone in the world asks the question of what's the best squat stance? How wide should my grip width be on bench? Should I deadlift sumo? No one ever addresses the fact that most people are walking around on breeze blocks, basically, with no force transfer, no stability, probably a much higher risk of knee, hip, back issues stemming, up the chain. So what are some things that people should be looking? So let's first off, how do we know we have a rooting problem? Because like if you look at the average person's foot, there's usually quite a lot going wrong. So without kind of getting too nerdy on that, what would you kind of say for people to look at in terms of like maybe the footwear choice and what their feet are like in a regular kind of barefoot scenario? What are we looking for to see if we have dysfunction?
Yeah, really good question. So first off, I'm going to come off as a bit of a hippie in this regard, but luckily it's becoming more and more mainstream, where I am a big believer in minimalist style shoes. I really am. I'll just be honest. It's a hard bias of mine, but the simple reason why is because, man, have I made massive improvements through making that transition myself, and through working with a lot of very good clinicians, I've started to understand the why behind it a little bit better. But at the same time, a lot of lifters are kind of dead upon arrival within their ability to have really good connection with the floor and great upstream function, simply due to the fact that, as you said, they're squatting on Brillo pads in a sense. They're squatting and running shoes or whatever the case may be. That's more geared towards gen pop and people of that nature. But at the same time, as far as assessing it goes, I think it always starts first with a barefoot squat assessment. That's something that's not done nearly enough. And upon looking at that, you can then get the needed framework or the needed information to develop a framework to actually improving it. It all starts with an assessment and needs analysis and then going from there. And oftentimes when we start with the barefoot squat, we get some fantastic information. So for example, we see knee cave in the squat, and that's a great topic we'll have to get into here a little bit more later on, but we see horrendous knee cave in the squat. We ask the question, why is that happening? Is it because they have not so balanced muscle co-contractions upstream? Is it because of a foot ankle issue? Is it because of trunk stability issue? What exactly is it? But upon seeing them squat barefoot, we get a lot of great information. Are they slipping into pronation, supination, shifting to the toes, shifting to the heels? Maybe it's as simple as their squat stance isn't ideal for their hip morphology and structure. Oftentimes that's the case as well. But very often when you see somebody squat barefoot, you can very clearly identify the fact that they aren't stacking the ankle very well. They have no idea how to splay and really use the intrinsic muscles within the foot to connect to the floor really well. And oftentimes they end up thinking they're doing that, but they just crunch the toes, decrease their surface area contact, and actually make it exponentially worse. And then all of a sudden we tend to see pronation of the foot or just caving in, and upstream downregulation, force production, stability, motor control, which then results oftentimes in knee cave. And then we have to ask the question, well, if that's the case, well, then maybe putting a band around the knees isn't the best solution for them specifically. Not to say that's inherently bad by any means, but oftentimes the knee caves simply due to something that's happening at the foot ankle complex. The reference I always like to use is when somebody has knee cave, it's typically due to, if it's a technique issue, it's typically due to one of two things. It's either the foot ankle complex or the hip trunk complex. That's typically the two places to go when that happens, assuming it's a technique issue. And the way I like to think about it is the knee is like a conduit of communication between the foot ankle and the hip. It doesn't think for itself. It doesn't do for itself. Another reference I love to use that I'm proud to say I made myself is the knee is kind of like a private in a stereotypical military movie, right? The private doesn't think for himself. He doesn't do for himself. He only does what his commanders tell him to do. Well, the commanders in this scenario is the foot ankle and the trunk hip. And if we can do a barefoot squat and identify that they're having pronation of the foot, poor motor control of their toes, splaying, gripping, whatever the case may be, and we see knee cave with it to a point where it's making them collapse in really hard, then we know that improving their foot function will then lead to better stacking upstream, better force production with it, and a more successful squat. So long-winded answer is that when we are looking at rooting, the first place I like to go is a barefoot squat. Another good analysis is a split squat. Another good analysis is actually looking at how their foot is structured. Oftentimes that gives us a lot of great information. So for example, example, the vast majority of time, not every time, but the vast majority of time, when somebody has very flat feet, they're going to have a much higher tendency to bias towards, when rooting's not great, bias towards pronation or collapsing in. When somebody has a very high arch, then they typically bias towards supination, shifting to the heels, things like that. So even looking at foot structure itself can kind of give us an idea or indicator of what we're more likely to suffer from when rooting is not up to par.
Would you say that toe structure comes into that as well? So what I'm saying is someone who's constantly wearing sneakers and narrow shoes, and their toes are all angled, like little toe and big toe are angled inwards, like so. Is that something that's worth addressing for most people? Because obviously, if you're naturally curved and angled in, your ability to reach out is going to be significantly less, I would presume.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I don't want to go into too long of an answer here, but I want to kind of describe what happened to me when I first got to Kabuki, because that was exactly me. I have notoriously flat Flintstone feet. I have feet that have been constantly stuck in shoes that are very, very narrow. And if you were to rewind and look at my foot like 6 years ago, it's exactly the structure you're describing. They were practically glued together. My pinky toe was slightly stacked on top of the toe next to it. And if you asked me to splay my toes, lift my toes, move one individually, I couldn't do any of that. I couldn't even splay. I had zero control over them individually. And then you're going to ask me to then have a good connection with the floor. Good luck. It's going to be very, very rough. So the first transition I made is simply training barefoot or minimalist style shoes. And immediately I had some improvements, though some of the musculature near there got very beat up, because as it turns out, when you go with shoes like that or go barefoot, you end up asking a lot more from your body as far as the foot ankle complex goes. But then I ran into an issue where it didn't really change as much as I thought it should. So then I realized, okay, well, if I train 2 hours a day, wear shoes the entire day, I walk around throughout the entire day. If I wear the right shoes or no shoes during squat session, and then immediately go back into these thick ass tennis shoes that take my foot and crunch it up into a balled up fist, maybe that's also causing an issue. So then I bias towards slowly ramping up, keyword is slow, wearing them in my everyday life as well. And that's when something really cool happened, where my foot structure quite literally changed shape. My resting state was a lot less stuck together. My pinky toe started to come out from over the top of the toe next to it. My motor control, I started being able to splay a little bit better, grip a little bit better, balance a little bit better. A lot of cool things happened simply from that. And then from time or over time, also through some drills, I was able to actually demonstrate really good competency within splaying, gripping without crunching, and having some great function within the foot from it. But one thing to reiterate there, because a lot of people will hear something like this and go, oh, say less. And they go minimal style from 0 to 100 like that. Shoe companies have been sued over claims around that. So here's the thing. It's kind of like wanting to bench press 500 pounds. You don't go straight to 500. There's a slow ramping up process. And when you go from something that constricts it so much to something that requires it to work naturally and work a lot harder, there has to be kind of some graded exposure to doing so. You have to slowly ramp it up. So for me personally, for example, I started with just my squat sessions, then my training sessions, then a few hours a day, then most hours a day, and eventually all throughout my day. And even through that time, it got quite sore along the time frame, but it never exceeded in a soreness level where injury was likely to occur.
What kind of soreness in what areas are we so like if someone goes and does this now, what are we expecting? Even if they do it right, what kind of soreness are we expecting to run into?
Mainly it was the soleus, the gastroc, some muscles around the ankle and ankle and calf definitely got a little bit beat up. But mainly it was muscles I've never felt before. So small little intrinsic muscles in the foot that honestly barely anybody knows the name of, myself included. They're pretty lengthy names for each individual one. But it just basically felt like the bottom of my foot especially was kind of cramping every time I overdid it a little bit. Every time I overdid it, it just felt like the bottom of my foot was cramping, almost like I was dehydrated. I had one of those classic cramps. It was like that constantly. And that was a good indicator to dial it back a little bit. But mainly it's muscles of that nature.
Sure. So like for the average lifter who's listening now, to try and maybe convince them that this is important, right? Like when you squat and deadlift, it's obvious. The foot is the conduit to force transfer through the floor. Even on bench, what are you using to maintain your leg drive, your setup, military press, whatever else? So I think it was it Fred Hatfield said the quote, like, you can't fire a cannon from a canoe. So
Yeah,
if you're
that's a
standing
good
on
one.
unstable feet, that's probably what you're trying to do. So hoping we've got some kind of buy-in now. Let's say I am that lifter with that crappy foot structure. You know, what do I do other than, you've mentioned the footwear process? That's great. But is there anything outside of that actively that we can look to do to improve that, not just the actual, you know, structure of the foot, but the ability to splay and grab, the ability to have stronger connection, you know, all those types of things?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So one of the things that I really like that has an unfortunate name, especially because there's anyways, is a foot love drill. Foot love drills are fantastic. So pretend these are my toes, fingers in between them, and simply roll it out. That's weirdly an effective start. Like it doesn't seem like it would work, but it works rather well actually to simply start like that. And then all of a sudden, when you take your hand out from under it, they splay a little bit more naturally. They splay a little bit easier. So starting off with something as simple as that prior to your drills can be really helpful. So starting off with that, and then going through drills where we just focus on splaying, relaxing, splaying, relaxing. Something as simple as that is really helpful. And then over time, we can start to work on, let's see if we can get the big toe individually to move on its own. Yeah, we can't. Okay. And there's a wall stretch drill that I really like, where you basically take an acu ball, a wall, a rack, whatever, and you put your big toe up against it and it's stretching. And then eventually you take it away and see if you can hold it up there yourself. You do that a few times, and all of a sudden you can lift up from the start. That was a transition I've seen with myself and other people, and you can do that with individual toes as well. With that being said, it's usually drills like that are very effective, but take a step further, other drills that really balance your ability to utilize that structure under loading conditions. So one great example that everybody knows of, though dear God, is it performed poorly most of the time, is hip airplanes. You know, things like that integrate the entire system is really fantastic. You're pushing external rotation, internal rotation, bracing, keeping the rib cage and pelvis stacked while rooting to the floor. And you can kind of give yourself somewhat of a graded exposure where you start with lightly grabbing a rack, then a PVC pipe, then grabbing nothing, something like that. But the hip airplanes is a great start to do it in a more functional manner, I guess you could say. And then we can start to add some load with some KB passes. That's an excellent exercise, really good one for warming up.
Is that where you stand on one leg and you would pass it from side to side?
Exactly. Think of almost like a single leg RDL at the start. You start to hinge, have the weight balanced over the foot, and then you stop roughly 1/4 of the way through a single leg RDL, hold that position, and then take a kettlebell and pass it back and forth. And you'll notice after a few reps, every muscle in there is just screaming at you. And drills like that are really fantastic as well. And then we can start to transition towards things that are a little bit more heavier loaded, maybe a single leg landmine squat or things of that nature that challenge it a whole lot, or single leg RDL, you know, cross body variations. You know, the exercise selection depends on the individual and the goal, but that's the somewhat steady ramp up process that I would suggest. But it does typically start with, in my opinion at least, simply changing your footwear, because there's a lot of research that shows us that in itself tends to cause some fantastic benefits. One of which that I experienced was seeing my foot go through hypertrophy, which, let me tell you, is kind of creepy. I mean, you're seeing your foot get like exponentially thicker was a very weird thing. Yeah, very weird.
So the kind of general trend I'm seeing there with the drills you're recommending is it's generally going to be single leg, single foot, and it involves increasing degrees of compensating for some kind of altering balance point.
Absolutely. Controlling center of mass through challenging the foot in a more and more drastic manner while increasing load and specificity.
So like goal. For someone who's at home and maybe doesn't know what to do, they can just think of it in their head, right? How do I create some instability in this position and then create a little bit more? Yeah,
I've even seen some like athletic development coaches even do like med ball tosses while on a single leg while doing that barefoot. That can be effective as well.
Okay.
So what if their starting point is more regressed? In other words, they're using insoles. You know, they're
good question.
Their chiropractor or whoever, you know, said, here's what you need to do. So they're always in insoles 24/7. Well, not, you know, every time they're leg, right?
Yeah.
Right. Because there's some issues that can arise from that. Right.
Yeah.
But to your point, what I've seen with people in those situations is they go from 0 to 100. Then they wonder why their plantar fasciitis is flaring up through the roof. Right. Yeah. So with them, what would be the first recommendation?
Yeah. So for me personally, if it is coming from a clinician, that ends up being a pretty hard spot for a coach.
Yes,
a really hard spot. I mean, to say it's an uphill battle is a understatement.
Yeah.
So what I typically like to do with an individual like that is I have to put my...
Well, let's just protect all of our asses here. Let's assume that there's compliance through that. Like the clinician is like, we need to get this person out of here just so they can have that force not be shifted into their hip or knee or so forth, because isn't that kind of what's going on?
Exactly. Yeah. And where I was going there is actually having a clinician in your network that can explain the nuances, talk to them, still help them through their foot issues, while you can kind of take a backward step and let the individual with a higher degree and kind of appeal to authority kind of walk them through that in a little bit more careful manner. Because I've seen the industry largely shift away from entirely using insoles, using arch support and things like that. And for very good reason. With emerging evidence, it tends to show that in most cases, they probably shouldn't be used. And at one point in time, they were very overprescribed. And I was one of those individuals. I was told to be in arch, arch support for quite some time. And didn't really help much of anything. So I'm a good example for this. When I first started going flat foot, you want to talk about plantar fasciitis. You want to talk about bottom of your foot cramping up. It was tough. It was really tough. So what I ended up doing was, in that gradual exposure, I still wore those for all my work jobs. While I was roofing, for example, I still wore them. So there's some individuals that, for reasons that I am not specialized in well enough to articulate, they may be somebody that still needs to have some existence of those. The gradual increase may have to be a little bit slower, but you also may need to have always a setting in your life, especially one that you walk around a lot, where you still include those in some degree. And typically in situations like that, I suggest they see a clinician in my network that has a profound understanding of that and can articulate it to them.
Yeah, sure. So assuming we've got good foot ability, what does a good root look like? And is it going to be lift dependent? Or is it the same principle throughout?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't think I've been asked the one where it's, is it the same across the board? That's interesting. Though I may change my mind later down the road, I believe that it would be the same throughout, at least in the way I coach it certainly is. But the way in which I like to cue it is, and there's a lot of cues you can use for this, is simply starting. So for example, if we unrack, walk out of squat, get into our squat position, I'm a big fan of a cadence of cues. Cadence of cues really sets an athlete off in the right direction as far as consistency and execution. I'm a big fan of that. But when that lifter is going through their cadence, I like to start with a splay. And the best cue I found personally is the short foot cue. And typically what that looks like is, especially for someone that's flat-footed, typically that cue is a little bit more needed, is their arch, like they go from flat-footed, for example, if you look at my foot do it, it goes from flat foot to creating a little bit of arch without actually seeing any toe crunch. And that's the big fault that so many people struggle with, which is why a lot of cues such as eagle claw has kind of largely been moved away from, though cues are highly individual. You may tell somebody that it drives the perfect effect. But that's why it's largely been avoided, because oftentimes with cues like that, it causes crunching. So oftentimes it's starting with a splay before we squat, splay, and then we go short foot, or we use something that uses those intrinsic muscles to kind of suction cup. I really like that cue. Suction cup to the floor without having the toes actually crunch. We maintain the splay. We maintain that wide base of support within the foot.
Yeah. So in a meathead sense, we're trying to contract the arch of the foot.
That's a great way of putting it.
Suppose, right? Shorten, stiffen, tighten, etc. And then the toes, we want the biggest surface area possible.
That's my hard bias. Yeah. In fact, flexion within the toes typically tells me that they need to work on the contraction within the actual foot a lot more, because their body just does not know how to distinguish those two things.
Sure. And you mentioned right at the beginning, the last question related to this topic, you have a bias towards minimalistic shoes, etc. Is that even above barefoot?
Oh, that's a
or
really
if someone
question.
is in a training environment, say like maybe the gym you've got next to the MMA gym, I'm not sure what your policies are, but some gyms are okay with it, right? Training barefoot. Should I favor that if I have the ability to train barefoot?
That's a really good question. But to preface that, even the reason why I'm sometimes a little bit timid of saying that is because there's always at least one individual that reaches out and says, but XYZ lifter squatted this in this shoe wear, and this is what happened, which I totally understand. To be very clear, I am sure as shit not saying you can't be strong in Chuck's, Converse, whatever the case may be. I'm not saying that whatsoever. Some of the strongest athletes in the world, people way stronger than me, have executed massive lifts. Credit to them. It's just that, things change over time, and I have found that to be more effective. And the same thing goes with any sport. In the early days of every sport, the equipment they had at the time worked effectively well, but things change over time. So that's why I always kind of preface with that statement. But as far as barefoot goes, If they allowed it in competition, that would probably be my bias, period, to be honest. And typically what I like to have the athlete do is in the initial phase of starting to shift over to this, squat 100% barefoot if it's available. If it's not available, then we do the next best thing, which can be a myriad of different shoes. For example, there's some slippers that are pretty good as well, but the important caveat there is just because a shoe is labeled minimalist does not mean it's minimalist. There's some minimalist style shoes out there that have such a narrow toe box, it stacks my toes on top of each other and is the furthest thing from ideal in my perspective. So minimalist can look a little bit different to each person based on structure, but furthermore, just because it's marketed as minimalist doesn't mean it actually is. And the three main requirements we're looking for with a shoe is 1, a wide enough toe box to actually splay effectively, 2, flat to the floor, and 3, minimal material separating your foot from the floor, because the more material you have, typically it degrades proprioception and connection with the floor, especially if it's softer material.
Sure. The way I've kind of worded it, and you may or may not agree with this, is that let's say we could train barefoot as much as possible. We create the strongest possible ability to root through our barefoot and put force down through the floor. Now, let's say in theory, it's an advantage to wear a barefoot shoe that has like a rubberized sole that allows us to create an artificial amount of traction, torque, whatever you want to call it, or an Olympic lifting shoe that has a super hard sole that we can push force through more effectively. Isn't that almost then like an ace card? Like if that were to be the case, if I train barefoot most of the time, the better I use my feet, the better I can use the shoe.
Oh, no, I can definitely agree with that. Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of Olympic lifting shoes, that's another really interesting conversation too, because a lot of people, when we talk about this, they bring up that as kind of like, oh, well, you know, this lifter did that, this lifter did that while wearing those. And it's kind of an awkward part to add to the conversation, but there's certainly advantages to that too. And for the longest time, Olympic lifting shoes were designed terribly, absolutely terribly. They didn't fulfill any of those requirements whatsoever. But now they're getting designed in a more and more advantageous nature where they have a pretty wide toe box. But when it comes to Olympic lifting shoes, there's definitely certain lifters out there that find it very advantageous for competition. They can typically stay a little bit more upright, hit depth easier, use their knee extensors more effectively. If they have some kind of back pain or injury, oftentimes it puts a little less strain on it. There's a myriad of different case examples for using those, and some people hit their best loads with them. But even a lot of lifters out there that use Olympic lifting for their heavier squats still will go barefoot or in minimal style shoes outside of it.
Sure, because I suppose you could become dependent on the heel elevation and the advantages it gives you. Sure.
Now, one thing I want to say that before we segue into the next comment is you kind of touched on it, that because you asked about exercise specific, is when they're working on trying to develop that rooting, it shouldn't just be on their top sets of squats or their top sets of bench. It should be on every movement they do. If they're doing, I joke around with the people like I did yesterday, like if you're doing a seated machine chest press, root your feet. You know, everything that you're doing, do it. Because if you're doing 5, 6 exercises per day in the gym and there's a few sets per exercises, you have the opportunity to reinforce that. Same thing you're trying to do in the squat every time you're in the standing position. Right, that's going to expedite the process of you being able to build that neural, connection with that whole thing, and make it stronger faster. Because when you get to some of the more complex things like the airplanes and stuff like that, you're not going to start people with that. They're going to have to develop that capacity, but that capacity could be kind of hacked if they're trying to do this with everything that they do when they're in the gym. You know, so I assume you guys would agree.
No, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that gets not talked about, and we're talking marginal gains here, but if you're going to lift, why not lift as well as you can? I can't remember the name of the phenomena. You may be better versed in this than I do, but the more muscles you have contracting hard at the same time, the higher your level of nervous system activation will go. In the same way that, like, you try doing a set of cable curls where you cup the bar, as in just let it sit, and then grip it as hard as humanly possible, or tricep extensions where they play no role at all. The same can be said for your foot and your calf. If all of those are rooting harder, your nervous system is a higher level of activate. Your body is like, oh, something serious is going down here type thing. So you can, if that in theory could buy you an extra half rep or 2 pounds or whatever on the lift you're doing, then why not? It's just for its effort, unfortunately. Yeah. But then we build subconscious habits that then it's not effort when we've done it for long enough.
Yeah, that neural drive increase is actually huge. And funny enough, I had to relearn that the other day in the silliest fashion possible, where I'll be honest, hindsight 2020, I was kind of half-assed in the hack squat a little bit. I really was. I was getting towards the end of my like 12, 15 rep set, whatever. And I got to like rep 10. I'm like shaking. I didn't think I was going to get the next rep. I'm like, oh shit. Okay, this isn't good. All right, next one, I'm going to do perfect. And all I did was simply engage lats, squeeze the handles. Did like 10 more. Like I was like, oh shit. This also applies for simple assistance exercises. So it's amazing how little things like that can be such a profound difference, even outside of the big three, which lifters are so guilty of only applying these principles for the big three.
And again, that then goes down around the conversation we always have to have conversation like, how do you define RPE and effort? Because if you're nearly failing because you kind of like sat in it like a lounger, and all of a sudden you grip and pull in like you're holding on for dear life, and all of a sudden you get to 10 more, it's like, well, was I at a 4?
Yeah.
Was I actually at a 4, or was that an 8? Really? Was it in terms of muscular recruitment? And then you're like, oh fuck.
Yeah, I might need to bring Mike T in here and ask him those questions. That'll be an interesting discussion.
All right, I need to use the restroom.
Okay.
Summer's here and so is the heat. I've spent most of my life training in unconditioned gyms, and I know most of you that are training in garage gyms, private gyms, black iron gyms, know what I'm talking about when I say the heat sucks. It kills your motivation to go to the gym, it kills your performance, but it doesn't have to if you keep your electrolytes up. That's why today's episode is sponsored by Element. Element is a tasty electrolyte drink with everything you need and nothing you don't. This means lots of salt with none of the junk. No sugar, no colors, no artificial ingredients, no gluten, no fillers, no BS. It contains an electrolyte ratio of 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium. Element can help prevent and eliminate headaches, muscle cramps, fatigue, brain fog, sleeplessness, and other common symptoms associated with electrolyte deficiency. Right now, Element is offering a free sample pack with any drink mix purchase. Get yours at drinkelement.com. This deal is only available through the Table Talk link.
Okay, next topic we're going to lead into would be the breathing and bracing.
So how important is people's breathing habits outside the gym then leading to performance inside? Because everyone's going to talk about breathing. How do I breathe for a maximal squat? How do I brace for a maximal squat? But if they're coming into the gym with really poor breathing mechanics, which usually ends up leading to poor posture, you know, it's like you said about like wearing crappy footwear 23 hours of the day and then wearing your minimalist shoes for an hour and expecting everything to change, right? So what, even in just a day-to-day sense, are people generally doing wrong with their breathing, which is leading to these kind of downstream effects?
Yeah, absolutely. So to start, obviously I have a hard bias towards believing that breathing, bracing, trunk stabilization is the most important foundation of loaded movement, especially axial loaded movement. And for me personally, I like to look at movement intervention or technique changes as kind of a hierarchy where we always start off with breathing, bracing, trunk stability. Then we go to rooting and foot ankle complex. Then we go hip, shoulder, depends on the movement of the individual. But I like to look at it through that hierarchy because oftentimes when a lifter has 5 different major opportunities for improvement in their lifts, just by taking care of trunk stability, you get rid of 3 of that 5. It's insane how effective it can be. And we always want to start with the changes that create the most holistic effect to their movement quality. And a lot of lifters instead will try to address everything at once, go down a rabbit hole, and nothing ends up actually being done. But when it comes to the discussion of breathing, that's a really interesting one. It's something that I've recently kind of gotten a lot deeper into with some help of some people around me, specifically a clinician who is named Dr. Philip Snell. He has his office is out of my gym. He's someone I collaborate with a lot and ask a lot of questions. And people like him, Sue Falso, and people like that are very good in the industry have kind of turned me on to the idea of even more so doubling down its importance, because people love to talk about breathing in relation to maximizing trunk stability for lifts. And don't get me wrong, that's really, really important. But the problem is that if somebody's stuck in a compensatory vertical stress adapted breathing pattern, trying to work on it and change it within 10 minutes before a heavy set is not only hard to do, I would go as far as to say basically impossible to do. And when it comes to stress adapted breathing patterns that are oftentimes vertical, for people that don't know, something like that we all catch ourselves doing the second we run to stress. When it comes to something like that, it has downsides that go far beyond just maximizing trunk stability for lifting. So one of which, for example, is getting into the autonomic nervous system, which is a very interesting topic. Another one of which you touched on, which is posture. But the nervous system one is rather important for a lot of reasons, especially for athletes, and even more so, I would say, lifters, where when we, and there's been a lot of research on this in the last 10 years, when we're stuck in a vertical breathing pattern like this, we end up getting into a place where we are kind of stuck into the sympathetic side of our autonomic nervous system. And for those of you who don't know, parasympathetic is oftentimes described as the rest and digest state, and the sympathetic is often described as the fight or flight. Technically, they're freeze as well, but fight or flight is typically what it's known as. And we are meant to live in the parasympathetic and shift into the sympathetic. And when we are stuck in the sympathetic, there's a lot of effects that ends up happening. You know, heart rate increases, pupils dilate, so on and so forth. But one of the major downsides for lifters is they can't digest as well. They can't, their appetite isn't quite the same. Sleeping is practically impossible. In fact, I've had lifters I've worked with recently, which I gotta say, I've been guilty of this in the past as well, where they're like, man, I just can't sleep for the life of me. I feel like I work out, I get really amped up, and I just never come down, and I lay awake at night, and I just toss and turn, and I can't go to bed. So I know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna take, cough syrup and melatonin and this and that and this and that special concoction of drugs and put my ass to sleep, which, don't get me wrong, for a short duration of time can work. Not a great long-term solution, but one of the greatest things you can do to better control your nervous system, your autonomic nervous system, is going to be deep rhythmic breathing application and getting the lifter or person to breathe in more of a horizontal fashion, more of a diaphragmatic fashion. And upon doing that and applying it through some specific drills and positions that force the lifter to do that, all of a sudden they can tap into the parasympathetic, live in the parasympathetic, and things like sleep tends to get a lot better. And this is something that I've been doing for quite some time. It's helped me immensely with that lifter I just mentioned. It helped him a lot too, where one application of many could be simply getting him in a feet-supported 90-90 position or something that forces spine neutrality. And then from there, doing deep rhythmic breathing within a certain cadence. So cadence is oftentimes debated a lot within research as far as what's best for what. But getting them to do that can shift into the parasympathetic, make sleep a lot easier. People typically notice their appetite gets a little bit better, their digestion gets a lot better. There's a lot of things in association with it that get immensely better. And the fact of the matter is, lifters tend to take a lot of what? Supplements, stimulants, and what do we have to do before a big lift? We have to get amped. We have to get amped as fuck. But then we tend to stay in that state. We tend to stay in that state for a long time, which hurts a lot of things that I mentioned, and even recovery. So applying deep rhythmic breathing practices that helps to regulate the nervous system, that helps to allow them to stabilize better, that allows them to change their breathing default to more of a horizontal fashion is a really great endeavor. The caveat is it's not all that sexy. In fact, it's not sexy whatsoever. And the hardship is a lot of lifters will try to change their default breathing just in their lifting. Good luck, because you lift an hour and a half a day, 2 hours a day, whatever the case may be, you breathe 24/7. So if you work on it for that duration of time and then immediately shift back to what you're used to, you'll just be chasing your tail your entire life. But the other caveat here, and this is something I've gone through for quite some time, even when you have great success with altering your default breathing pattern and experience some of the benefits I just mentioned, still, the second you run into a stressful situation, you default right back towards that vertical breathing pattern. So for me personally, for example, there's been times in which I first started getting into this where I made huge improvements, started having a lot of success, and then family member dies or, get in a fight with a significant other or something bad happen at work. And then all of a sudden your first response is, and you change that default like that. So it's something you'll likely have to revisit fairly consistently throughout your life.
Sure. I think this is worth bringing up because it came up yesterday, because you mentioned psyching up for a lift there and stimulants and stuff like that. The preconception is that everyone benefits from that.
Oh, that's a good one.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's just talk about those, the arousal performance bell curve, right? Let's talk about, everyone knows how to deal with the people on the left-hand side. You shove ammonia in their nose, smack them around the head, tell them you fucking hate them or whatever, right? Let's talk about the people who naturally sit on the right-hand side, whether it's life circumstance or just neurology or whatever, but they're the naturally anxious overthinkers, the chokers. They're looking at that population going, that's what I need to do a big lift, right? Which is not okay. So since we're talking about the effect on the parasympathetic nervous system, are some of these practices some things that those population could actually benefit from in their performance, even when doing those higher stress tasks?
Yeah, and in all honesty, I'd love to ask you 2 questions at some point in time as far as some meet day approaches you have. But one of the things I'd love to talk about